Part of my family is originally from a town called San Felipe XXLA, which is located in the state of Tlaxcala. During the 40s and 50s, he was known for the constant appearances of Nahuales and witches, and what I am going to tell you happened to my grandfather several years before he married my grandmother. He would have been about 18 years old. He was a rather cheerful young man who liked to hang out with his friends late at night. One night, when he finished his work in the fields, he met with 3 of his friends to spend some time in the middle of the cornfields. One of them brought corn for roasting and the other 2 some bottles of brandy. Alcohol soon rose and they began to brag about their fights and love conquests. Suddenly, my grandfather heard a noise coming from among the cornfields. At first his classmates did not believe him. But he insisted so much that everyone was silent for a moment. After a certain silence, the same noise was heard again, and now 2 of his friends took their carbines to scare it away, whether it was some miscreant or some absent-minded coyote. Even my grandfather threw some dirt on the fire to lessen the intensity of the fire. They waited several minutes and were already beginning to get bored when the noise was repeated again, only this time it was heard much closer to them. Something heavy ran over the grass. They hid among the cornfields, and what they saw was a black donkey without a tail carrying a pig. "It's a Nahual," they all exclaimed, and immediately made the sign of the cross. One of them planted his machete in the ground, which he had blessed days before, and this animal stopped suddenly as if something had paralyzed him at that moment. Then Grandpa took out his braided whip and approached the donkey to beat him. The Nahual shrank at the blows he gave and, says the grandfather, began to roll in a frightful way like if he were having an epileptic seizure. Thus, little by little, he took on the form of a young man of about 20 years of age. That man begged him not to beat him anymore. He told him that he came from a neighboring town and that he had been forced to steal because he was very poor and that he did not have money to pay the expenses of his wedding, since he was going to get married in 3 days, and that only in this way he had gotten some animals to feed the guests. My grandfather and his friends felt sorry for him. They helped him. He got up and was even invited to eat corn and a few drinks of hot water. They drank with him and toasted to the health of his future wife and even cooperated with him with some pesos for his celebration. The Nahual, extremely grateful, invited them to his wedding, gave them the address telling them to ask for Camilo, and left with the pig on his back. 3 days later, my grandfather and his friends went to the wedding. Camilo was the boyfriend and the person they had drunk with that night. When they arrived, the gen received him very well. He was the guest of honor and even gave each of them an etiquette for the road. Some time later, people told my grandfather not to get together with Camilo, since he had a reputation for being Nahual, but he never seemed to care much about that reference. Well, he always told us that a grateful man deep down couldn't be a bad person. Applause. Story shared by Victor. My name is Victor and I work in a place called Santa Fe. I go to work there at 7 in the morning, so in order for me to go to work, I have to get to work, so I have to leave at 6 in the morning. There are 2 paths to get to my job, a short one and a long one. The long one consists of walking around a couple of neighborhoods and reaching the bus stop that takes me to Santa Fe. The short path crosses a pantheon in a straight line between the tombs and reaches that same stop, but with about 20 minutes of saving the way. Every day I met another neighbor who was walking around and we accompanied each other differently. I was walking among the tombs as usual, and I observed in the distance a black silhouette in the shape of a man standing on the side of the road. I always had my cell phone lamp on to see the path, and I raised it in the direction of the shadow, but it crossed the street and got between the graves. I got to that point in a matter of 10 seconds. I was looking for him to see if he was someone, but he was alone. I didn't see a way he could hide from me or if it was somewhere, because there were only tombstones and crosses in that place, so I better stop looking for him and continued walking to my destination. On another occasion, I was walking and I came across a large Rottweiler-type dog. He stood in front of me and wouldn't let me walk. I was very afraid that he would bite me, but I waited a little and tried to turn him around. I noticed that he was staring at me. Although when I passed it he did not follow me. I couldn't see where he had gotten himself either. On the last occasion he walked at the same time. With the gloom of the trees and the moonlight, I saw a dog approaching in the distance. I thought it was the same one I had encountered a few days before, so I dimmed the light of the lamp and looked for a stone to be able to defend myself from the animal. I found 1/2 of a brick and took it. When I raised the light of the lamp, I wanted to see how far away that black dog was coming, and my surprise was that it was no longer a dog that was in that place, but rather a person. This man was dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt with a hat covering his head. I swear I got a shiver, and as we passed each other, he passed me without making any movement. He didn't look at me either. Was like I didn't. I would have seen practically. I decided to walk quickly and tried to turn around so that he would not surprise me from behind, but this person just went on his way. To this day I still think that was a wall. Because of this, I haven't been there again. My friend, unfortunately, died in that place. He was found dead on the way. He always told me that there was a woman who followed him. Sometimes he even waited for her and she could never reach him. He asked me on several occasions if I hadn't seen her, but fortunately it never touched me. I suppose that in the end he did find her face to face and died of a heart attack after her death. I didn't want to go on that road to save myself a few minutes. I had better turn it around. Even if I walked more and got up earlier, it is much safer to do that than to walk in that cemetery again. Applause. The following story was something that happened to us in January 2016. This happened to my boyfriend, a friend, his girlfriend and me. Of course, we vacationed in the state of Campeche and visited some old cities. My friend put his truck in and he and my boyfriend took turns driving. We arrived at a place called Calakmul and waited along with other hikers for the guide who had assigned us. A few minutes later a tall, stocky, white man with green eyes arrived. He seemed to be of German nationality and it was clear that in his youth he had been a rather handsome man. This man introduced himself as an archaeologist and told us his last name, which I have already forgotten because of my mispronunciation, but I remember it easily. And it is that. He spoke Spanish very well and was also a very friendly person. During the tour we learned interesting things about that ancient Mayan city. I even thought that our guide liked us because of all the visitors we were the group that showed the most interest and asked multiple questions about the place. During a break we approached the guide to spend time with him. Soon after, this gentleman trusted us enough to tell us a little about his life. He was originally from a small town in Austria and had arrived in Mexico when he was a few months old, since his parents had fled the Nazi regime. Growing up, he married a woman originally from Yucatan. She had a postdoc and taught graduate students at the Autonomous University of that state. Despite her studies, she had never denied her roots. She had even introduced it so much that the man said he felt more Mayan than Austrian. After a long talk, my boyfriend dared to ask him what it was. What he did not like about Mexico, and that man answered us without hesitation, was the little care that the government gave to archaeological sites, since there is a lot of looting in them. He also told us that he and a group of people did everything possible to confront the theft of pre-Hispanic pieces, even reaching incredible levels, but that in the end it was all worth it. When we finished the tour we said goodbye to the guide and hurried to get into the van. We wanted to get back to our hotel before it got dark, not because we had fear but because the place was surrounded by jungle and we were not very familiar with the way back. It was 6 in the afternoon. We had been in the car for 15 minutes when my friend, who was driving, pulled over the road to go to the bathroom. My boyfriend took advantage and went down with him. About 5 minutes passed and they did not return. The other girl and I began to despair because of their absence and more because the fog was forming, and that's when we saw them arrive. My boyfriend was carrying a stone in his hands that was approximately 20 meters tall. They went up and I could see it more closely. It was a rock that simulated a person kneeling with a head larger than the body. I can't tell if it alluded to a dwarf or a child, but it was quite peculiar. They told us that they found her half buried at the foot of a tree and that it had taken so long because they were arguing about whether to take her or not. We wanted them to leave it back in its place since we remembered the archaeologist's words, but they did not listen to us and we continued. Our way had passed half an hour and the fog was not thick, but they had to drive carefully to avoid any accidents. At that time, my friend was driving and my boyfriend was in the passenger seat. My friend's girlfriend was contemplating the scenery when she suddenly pointed me to the back of the truck. "Did you see?" he asked me. I said no and tried to see where she was pointing. "There was an animal out there," he added. I couldn't see anything so the girl didn't insist. However, after a few minutes, I observed something advancing rapidly between the fog was large, white and moved on all fours. "That's it?" I asked him. She nodded and we immediately told the others. Those who had not paid much attention to that event. "Don't worry, we can scare that animal away with the noise of the horn," my boyfriend commented, unconcerned. A few seconds had passed when my friend stopped the car and pointed straight ahead. Despite the fog, we saw a huge white dog that looked more like a wolf, whose gaze was bright and green. Something strange was that he did not look at us with threatening eyes. Although he was watching us all, the strangest thing was that this being seemed familiar to me. The wolf jumped to the side of the road and got lost, or so we wanted to believe. It seems that he was following us. "I've seen it since they built that rock," my friend's girlfriend commented. The boys looked at each other and my boyfriend got out of the car and left the statue they had found in a safe place. After that, we resumed the trip without any incident until my friend came up with the idea of remarking, "You can call me crazy, but that dog looked like it." Hearing the guide, we were all dumbfounded. I realized that I was not the only one who had linked him to this man. However, we can prove nothing. Shortly after what happened, it led me to reflect that, although there are people capable of transforming themselves into animals to make mischief or commit acts of evil, perhaps it would not be so foolish to think that there are people who do it to protect sacred places. Or what do you think? Applause. This story happened to my great-grandfather, may he rest in peace. He was originally from the town of San Felipe, Exa, located in the state of Tlaxcala, which was about a day's drive from a rancheria called La Rosita. It should be noted that this happened in the 40s. La Rosita belonged to a very rich man named Don Tomas, who in life was suspected of having been a Nahual, but it could never be proven. What was undoubted is that this person had had a despotic and aggressive character, and when he died, people only went to accompany his wife and children, because they had always been good people. The great-grandfather was a friend of one of them, and she attended the funeral with her great-grandmother and her eldest son from the first day they were watching over that man. Very strange things happened in the night. Prayers were interrupted several times as people listened as if a very heavy animal was walking on the roof. That thing seemed to know the exact place where the coffin of the deceased was placed, for once it was placed on top of it, it scratched the tiles with large, thick claws. People were scared. The women dedicated themselves to praying while 4 men placed. The stairs were armed with their machete and they hurried up. Among these men was the great-grandfather. He says that when they reached the roof they were surprised not to see anything. The thing was gone, and judging by the weight they described, it was impossible for it to have jumped without making a sound. When they came down, people had gathered around them to ask for news about what had happened. But before they could speak, some women, including the grandmother, began to cry and vomit. Others had severe headaches such as, if they had had a bad air on the second day, the great-grandparents agreed that she would return home accompanied by her son. They left at a good time, leaving him alone, but not before his great-grandmother gave him a scapular. The morning and afternoon passed without any news. People continued to talk about the event of the previous night, hoping that it would not be repeated. When night came, the great-grandfather went with Don Tomas' family to distribute bread, atole and coffee. The people who had arrived were many, and in the end, he was so tired that he inadvertently fell asleep as people began to pray. He had a rather strange dream. He says that he was at the top of a ravine thinking about how to get down when a man arrived, chased by 2 huge black dogs with red eyes shining like fire and without a tail. The man begged loudly while telling those beings to leave him alone, that he was no longer one of their own, but the dogs did not pay attention to him and tore him to pieces. The great-grandfather woke up in horror. The dream had seemed quite vivid to him, but he was reassured to see that it was already daylight. However, he was very wrong to think that everything would go smoothly, because when he went out to the part of the courtyard where the people were gathered for breakfast, he found the visitors dismayed. It is necessary to clarify that more than 200 people had attended that funeral and that, while some prayed in the room and in the corridors where Tomas was being held, many others fell asleep in the open. The great-grandfather had fallen fast asleep. He slept in one of the corridors, so he had not noticed that a black donkey had gone at dawn to step on the people who slept in the courtyards. After that event, many people withdrew. They even pressured the family to bury the deceased as soon as possible, but the widow replied that the priest was reluctant to officiate the mass for her husband, given his famous fame as Nahal, but all this was a matter of time, since her children were convincing her to change her mind. It seems that the only thing that held people back was that one of Don Tomas' sons arrived with the news that the priest had finally agreed and that the next day he was waiting for them to give the deceased a Christian burial. However, the last night that the great-grandfather spent in that rancheria was the worst. He was praying a rosary for the soul of the deceased and it was midnight. The people were already quite tired, both physically and morally, when suddenly the door to the main entrance of the room where the coffin was located. At that moment 2 huge dogs entered, very similar to those his great-grandfather had dreamed of. People were very frightened to the point of not being able to pray. They remained in the places in silence and did not dare to move, because they had all resigned themselves to the worst happening. Suddenly, a cold wind blew out the candles just as those beasts approached the coffin. A shrill noise was heard and then they were dragging a heavy bundle at high speed. There was a desperate silence. Until someone said he was gone. When they lit the candles again, they realized that the coffin was turned upside down and that Don Tomas' body was no longer there. People began to pray to be cured of the fright, while others murmured that those dogs had only gone for Don Tomas, since if they had wanted to do any harm, they would have done it without any consideration. The next day the family of the deceased had to throw stones in the coffin to make it weigh and have something to bury. People didn't want to stay for The Rosaries were afraid that more unpleasant things would happen to them at night. For his part, the great-grandfather affirmed that the man with whom he had dreamed that night must be none other than Don Tomas, who at that moment surely lay in hell, paying for all those misdeeds he did in life as a Nahual.